Hi, everyone. Happy Wednesday. I'm going to share my screen and I want to thank you all for being here. I know it's lunchtime, so please feel free to enjoy your lunch throughout this too. And just thank you for being here again. So my presentation today is on cultivating equitable student success in colleges and universities. And so if you've been to any of my other presentations that are on any sort of topic that has anything to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion, you've probably seen this slide before. And so I kind of just like to put it in all of these different kinds of presentations, but it's that conversations on diversity, equity, and inclusion can get uncomfortable, and that's okay. Getting comfortable with being uncomfortable is what helps moves us forward. And so throughout the presentation today, if there's ever a time where you are feeling some sort of discomfort for some reason, I do encourage you to kind of lean into that and help reflect on that, because it really does help us move forward together when we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so Chelsea has given a wonderful introduction, but just a little bit more about me and kind of about how I got into diversity, equity, and inclusion. I want to share a little bit about myself. And so I was born and raised in Miami, Florida. And for those of you who aren't as familiar with Miami, Florida, it is a very, very diverse area. I actually have the racial demographics down there in the bottom. And so you can see that our Hispanic population is at 68%, our Black population at almost 19%, white at 11%, and then Asian is at 0.9%. And so growing up in Miami, there weren't a lot of people who looked like me. And so that kind of made me very aware of my status as a person of color from an early age. While it is very diverse, there feels like there's a good lack of cultural competency within Miami. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of what I experienced growing up there in a second. There was this shame that kind of took place that was associated with being Asian that I started feeling as I grew up. And so throughout my elementary years, I actually used to have my dad would come in and give a presentation every year for Chinese New Year's to my class. And I remember when I was younger, I was so excited about that, to have him come in, and it wasn't something he often did. But as I grew up and grew a little bit older, around 4th or 5th grade, I just told him I didn't want him to come anymore. And the reason was that people were just saying so many different things about being Asian and pointing out different things to me, asking me questions about my eyes or asking me questions about what kind of food I ate. That at one point, it kind of just became this shame that got associated with it. And I didn't want people to think about me being Asian. I just wanted to kind of almost hide that part of me. And so part of why I got into diversity, equity, and inclusion later on is coming from these experiences and really wanting to make sure that other people don't feel that way later on too. When I was applying for college, I actually had a really interesting experience where I went to my college advisor at my school and I had a list of colleges that I wanted to apply to. And she told me, you're probably not going to get into any of these colleges because colleges just don't want your people. And when she said your people, she meant Asian Americans. And so there was, again, this feeling of just, a shame that was with it, but really pointing out that this was a big characteristic of who I am. Also, later on, we would meet with my parents, and the whole conversation actually became the fact that I should check off white on the board, on kind of all the boxes for all my different applications for colleges, because I am biracial. And then on top of that, that I should consider legally changing my last name. And so changing it to my mom's maiden name because my last name is too Asian. And so they would know I was Asian, even if I check off a white box. And so this was actually information that we went home and really truly thought about and even looked into what that process would look like to change my last name. But at the end of the day, my mom doesn't even go by that last name. She goes by Wang too. And so I would have been the only one in my immediate family with that last name. And it felt like I would be losing a part of who I was. And so I decided not to do it. But all of these different experiences kind of helped me really move into this passion of having more cultural competence on campuses, but also just in the world in general. And so when I talk about how Miami was not the most culturally competent place, these are some of the things that would get said to me on a daily basis. And so things like, do you see in widescreen was always a jest that students would make. But I actually had teachers say it to me too when I asked to sit closer to the board when I was in high school because I can't see because I wear glasses. A comment got made like, oh, it's because she sees in widescreen to the whole class. And so the class laughs and I kind of laughed too, because at that time it was better to be laughing with them than feel like they were laughing at me. It was this kind of theme that I thought about when I was in high school. And now that I'm able to reflect on that, I realize there are so many different opportunities for me to intervene and question and say, what do you mean by that? And really have these kind of learning experiences. But at this time of my life, I just wasn't in that place. And so this idea of also feeling this shame associated with being Asian led to this nickname that my friends would give me, and they would call me a defective Asian. And a lot of that was because I just didn't fit into the stereotypes that they associate with being Asian. And so you kind of see all these different things that kind of got said to me on a daily basis that really fed into why diversity, equity, inclusion became so important to me later on. The little Oriental girl was how teachers referred to me to another teacher in front of me. Most of my friends' parents didn't actually call me by my name. They just called me La China, which is the Chinese girl in Spanish. And so that kind of just became how I was referred to. And so while everyone else was called by their name, I was just La China. And it's because in Miami, there are so few that I literally was one of the few Chinese girls there. Again, different stereotypes, like I thought Asians were supposed to be good at math that were thrown at me constantly, just different disparaging remarks that were made for me through different things. And again, just these little microaggressions that got said on a daily basis, but really kind of helped fuel my passion later on for diversity, equity, and inclusion. When I moved to Boston for college, I went to Emmanuel College for my undergrad experience, which is a small college in Boston. And it was really this huge culture shock. I was born and raised in Miami. I had never lived anywhere else. Boston has a much higher Asian population. And so for the first time, I was looking around and seeing people like me. And it was kind of this, again, this culture shock of, wow. But really, this is where I started learning more about diversity, equity, and inclusion and realizing all the different opportunities for learning and growing throughout it. While I was at Emmanuel College, I got really involved and I became student government president. I was on student government all 4 years. And I would always say that I wanted everyone's voice to be heard. But then at one point, I looked around the table and I realized that we were missing voices. I realized it was an all white board with the exception of myself. And so it really wasn't that everyone's voice was being heard. And so I worked to help develop a position for a representative for diversity, equity, and inclusion on that board. And so that really helped kind of bring to light a voice that we didn't have present before. When I brought that to the table, it really, all of a sudden, the conversations that we had shifted and they changed. And so that really ignited my passion to see what the difference can be when we do bring these different voices to the table. And again, really ignite that passion for exploring equitable student success in higher education. That passion took me to Harvard, where I got my master's degree in higher education. And while I was there, I looked at accessibility, sense of belonging for students of color, and persistence. So my cohort from my Harvard class is actually that picture at the bottom. And then I have a picture of me from Emmanuel College and also from Harvard when we had our kind of graduation. It was a pandemic class, so it wasn't a true graduation. While I was at Harvard, I took a class that really inspired what I do now. And so that class was actually called Redesigning Colleges and Universities for Equitable Student Success. And so I always had these two passions in higher education. And one of them was equity and inclusion and diversity. And one of them was student success. But I always saw them as two different things. And then I took this class and all of a sudden I realized how much these two worlds melded together and how important it is that when we're looking at student success, we're not just looking at student success, we're looking at equitable student success. And the importance of that is shown even here. And so if we look at our ETSU 6-year enrollment, so this is our graduation rate, we see that it's at 50%. This is data from fall of 2014. It's the 6th year, so it's actually data from 2020. So this is the most recent data that's on the National Center for Education Statistics. And so we look at that a lot of times. We look at that number to make sure that our enrollment and our retention is where it's at, basically. But then if we delve into it further, we can see that our retention rate for male students is slightly lower than our retention rate for female students, about 10% lower. And so that's where we find out that we have, maybe we need to be paying a little bit more attention to our male students, especially looking at what resources we have available to them. Where the real issue comes is when we look at it and we break it down by race. And so when we look at our 6-year retention rate by race, we can see that for white students, they graduate at 53%. For Latinx students, 40%, Asian students, 64%. But our Black or African American students are graduating at a 27% rate. And what that means is that 73% of our Black students never get across that graduation stage. And so they come here, they take out money, they take out loans, they stop working because they're going to classes or they work less hours, and then they don't graduate. And so they are arguably worse off than they were before they came here. And so this is definitely an issue and something that we need to be tackling and paying attention to. And so this kind of highlights the importance of equitable student success, right? It's not just about that overall 50% retention rate. It's about making sure it's equitable across the board. And so looking at something like this and saying 27% is not even close to 50%. And this is somewhere where we really need to be paying attention to. So when we talk about this equitable student success, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the research that I did. And my research really did focus predominantly on students of color and first-generation students. But when we talk about equitable student success in a wider way, I also want us to be thinking about these different things too. And so that's why I kind of put them all here. And so we're talking about students with disabilities. We're talking about first-gen students and students of color, but we're also talking about low-income students, students coming from rural communities, students who identify with different genders and different pronouns, students from different religious backgrounds, LGBTQ plus students, and so much more. And so it really is this wider scope of making sure that we're looking at it through all of these different lenses. I love this quote, and I think it's kind of what we're all here today to talk about and do. And so the quote is, "Equality is leaving the door open for anyone who has the means to approach it. Equity is ensuring there is a pathway to that door for those who need it." And so what we do every day in higher education, especially when we're doing equitable student success and we're working through that, is making sure there is that pathway available for the students who need it to get to that graduation stage, to get to that door. So when we look at enrollment at Clemmer College, we look at it through the scope of 7As. And this was designed by Dr. Greg Aloya, Dr. Scott Jenkinson, and Dr. Janice Scarborough, our current dean. And so it's these 7 things. And so access, how do students know about Clemmer College and ETSU? Do they know that we exist? What do they know about it? How do they find out information that we're here and that they could come here? So this is really targeting prospective students. Apply. So once students apply, are we making sure that they've been able to complete the application? Admit, are they admitted? So they've applied, but are they actually admitted? Do we actually say, hey, welcome to ETSU, we're happy to have you? And then when that happens, do they actually accept that admittance? And so that's that 4th one, because a lot of students could be admitted, but then decide to go somewhere else that they were also admitted to. Once they accept, we have this phenomenon of summer melt that happens between accept and attend. And so they've accepted, they said, I'm going to come to ETSU, but we know that not every student who accepts actually shows up on that first day of classes. And so who's actually showing up then is kind of that accept to attend area. Once they attend, we want to make sure they achieve. And so achieve for us is really synonymous with retention. We want to make sure that they actually are able to do what they set out to do, and that is graduate from here. And so making sure they get across that graduation stage is that achieve, and then alumni. And so we're making sure that our students stay engaged with us, come back to campus, whether that's through mentorship programs, whether that's through making donations, whether that's through word of mouth and sharing that with other people. And the beautiful thing about this is that alumni actually then funnels back into access, and it really does come full circle, because they're the people who go out there and share the ETSU story, share the Clemmer College story about who we are, and help other prospective students get to know about us. And so that's how we look at enrollment throughout this and kind of student success. But then what happens when we start looking at this through an equity lens? And so I thought this would be a good example to kind of share what we think about when we do think about equity. And so all of a sudden with access, we're also thinking about things like, which areas and neighborhoods are we marketing ETSU and Clemmer College in? Are they predominantly white neighborhoods? And if so, then how are we reaching students of color when we say that one of our big pushes is to bring more students of color to campus? How are we reaching rural communities? And if we're not, a lot of times, a lot of students who are in rural communities also identify as being students who are lower income. And so are we only really reaching more privileged students? Are our brochures only in English? And if so, how do parents who say speak only Spanish learn about Clemmer College, learn about ETSU? So how are they learning about the college is something that we also have to question. And so these are some of the things that we would question as we look at this through an equity lens. With apply, can low-income students afford the application? Are there vouchers for students who can't? Can students with disabilities easily complete the application? I will say that I think ETSU is pretty good at considering a lot of these things, but this is just important for any college or university to consider as you're thinking about these different steps. With admit, once students are admitted, can low-income students actually afford the tuition? Because if they can't, then they're not going to come here. Can non-local students afford housing? A lot of times if we want to diversify our students, we have to pull on different populations because we know that our local population is also predominantly white. But that means students coming from farther away and students who don't have parents or friends that they can live with or other family here. And so how are they able to afford housing here? And then during tours, do students of color see other students who look like them? This is important because we do have a habit of highlighting a lot of students of color in our brochures and our billboards and our marketing materials. But it's one thing to have them in there, and it's another thing for a student, a prospective student, to come to campus, look around and not see any students who look like them. And if that's the case, then the likelihood of them coming here is more slim because they're going to say, this isn't a place for people like me. I don't see myself here. Except, do first generation students know what they have to do over summer? So there is a whole to-do list over summer before you can actually come to college. Part of that is immunizations. It's attending orientation. It's registering for classmates. It's enrolling in a payment plan. Are they aware of all these different steps because they don't have someone at home like students who aren't first gen might have who have gone through a similar process and can kind of guide them through that? What scholarships are available to students is important too, because they might accept, but then they might realize over summer, you know what, financially, I really can't do this. And so I'm not actually going to be able to show up on that first day of classes. When it comes to attend, we have the students here now, but can the low-income students afford textbooks? Are underrepresented students able to find community? So are students of color able to find community if they're looking around and not seeing a lot of students who look like them? Are there work-study opportunities, especially for low-income students? And so are we really making sure they have some of these resources that they need? Once students are here, we want them to be able to get across that graduation stage, right? And so we have to ask, can low-income students balance work and school? I've had so many people complain to me and say, students are just not doing well. It's because they're working insane hours. And it is true, but at the same time, they couldn't be here if they weren't working those insane hours because they have to do that in order to afford the tuition here, in order to afford housing, in order to afford textbooks. And so thinking about that when we talk with students, especially students who are working some of these kind of crazy hour jobs. Are there supports for students of color? Are there extra resources for students who might look around and not see a lot of representation or come from backgrounds that might require a few more extra resources to really help them, especially knowing that a lot of students of color also identify as first generation students? Our tuition rises and cost of living increasing, causing specific populations of students to withdraw. And so just like we look at retention and we break it down by race and gender, we also need to be looking at our withdrawal rate and thinking about how students are leaving and what do they have in common. And where are students living? Are they living on campus? Or are they living with parents? Are they living in unsafe situations? Are they living out of their cars? I've worked with many students who struggle with homelessness here. And so really making sure we're taking all of that into account is important too. And with alumni, what populations of alumni aren't engaged? Are they all equally engaged if we look at it again by gender, by racial background? Are there ways beyond donating to give back? So if students are low income, a lot of times alumni feel like the only way to give back to a college is by donating because that's what we really advertise. But also, could there be mentorship opportunities? Could there be other ways that we can keep these students engaged? And so this is kind of how we look through an equity lens at a few different things. There's a lot more ways to do this too, but this just kind of gives you an example of what we mean when we talk about looking at things through an equity lens. When I think about student success and equitable student success, I often think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And so we know that for physiological needs have to be met in order to move up and eventually get to that area of self-actualization. If we think about this in terms of degree completion too, and change self-actualization out for degree completion, this is also relevant. And so physiological needs, if students are struggling with food insecurity, I talked with a student today who's struggling with that. Homelessness, I worked with a student last week who was struggling with that. Working at night, yesterday I talked to a student who works all night long from 1 a.m. to 9 a.m. in the morning and then has to go to classes and is just exhausted in their classes. Or students who have young children. The idea is that some of these most basic needs aren't being met. And so it makes it even more challenging for them to be successful academically when they're not being met at home or personally. Safety needs. We have students who are living in unsafe environments that we help kind of find different housing available for them. I've worked with a few students going through things like that. We have students who have lost their job, especially with the pandemic. It really changed the face of employment around here. We have students who have been cut off from their family. So maybe their family was supporting them, but then said they weren't. I've worked with a lot of LGBTQ plus students who have said that they have come out to their parents and their parents have basically disowned them, refused to pay, what they were paying for before, have kicked them out of their house. And so they're now struggling with some of these safety needs. And then of course we have students who have come down with COVID, who are sick, or who have children who are sick, or people that they are responsible for that are sick in their family. Love and belonging. Students can feel outcasted. So students who come here but don't see other students who feel or look like them, they might feel outcasted, and that also goes into that sense of belonging. They haven't found community here. They don't see others who look like them. Or again, students who've been rejected by their family or friends for coming out. So all of these are different examples of how love and belonging might not be being met. Esteem. Respect, self-esteem, status, recognition, strength, freedom. Students can also struggle with this. So maybe they have all these other needs that are met, but then they might struggle with imposter syndrome in classes. They may look around and think that everybody knows more than they do. There are students who feel like they are a token. And so this is something we see often with students of color, that they feel like they are a token, that they are here because of affirmative action, and that is the reason they were admitted. These are things that they may have been told or internalized. And so there's that feeling, and again, it can really impact that esteem. And then students who feel silenced in class. I've also spoken to a few different students of color who have shared that there are times in class where they wish they could speak up, but they feel scared to do so because it's in disagreement with what the majority of the class has said or with what the instructor has said. And again, they're already feeling like they are the only person in their race in that room, and they don't want to be the only person who disagrees too, or share that through their perspective. This is actually a lot different through a perspective of a person of color, or a person who comes from a low income background, or a person with a disability. And so they can also struggle with that, which goes into being able to have that freedom of speech, but also that strength, being able to share what they know and ultimately esteem as a whole. So while I was at Harvard, I really aimed to investigate historically underrepresented student success in predominantly white institutions of higher education through an examination of the unique obstacles facing students of color and an exploration on how to encourage persistence to graduation by combating these challenges. And so what I identified from that research were different barriers that students faced. And those were barriers like a sense of isolation, absence of cultural competency at the institution, which we find often in predominantly white universities. And again, with that kind of battling stereotypes, so that lack of cultural competency, all of a sudden you feel like you're always kind of on the defense because you're constantly battling these stereotypes. Economic barriers, and we know that many times students of color and first generation students are also disproportionately facing economic barriers. Lack of mentors with similar ethnicities and backgrounds, again, commonplace at predominantly white institutions. Lack of academic readiness that may have stemmed from just not having equitable secondary school experiences as it would if they were a white student, or a student who wasn't, struggling again with being low income or something akin to that. And then being first generation. And again, students of color, many of them identify as first generation as well. From the population of students that I worked with through this research, I believe it was about 72% that identified as being first generation on top of being a student of color. So through some of this research, I interviewed a few different students. And so some of the responses I have here today. And so this is not all of them, but a few of them that I really thought stuck out with me. I interviewed, I believe it was around 54 or 55 students that we interviewed. And so one of the students said, my first night at the college, a white student came up to me and started petting my braids in wonder. And so this is a Black female student. That experience was very shocking. And that was when I realized that I was in a place completely different from what I was used to. And so this student moved here actually from a much more diverse city. And she moved to this school that was predominantly white. And again, was one of the few, if only, Black students there. It can oftentimes be overwhelming as a student of color to have to represent my entire culture in class discussions and racial bias incidents and beyond. There have been moments in classes where I'd be taken aback by the lack of contextual understanding some students seem to have when talking about race in urban settings. And so again, offensive things that are said in class that people may not even realize are offensive. I still feel as if I'm helping my college meet a quota. My white peers will never know how it feels to be here because of your skin color. And courses at my college did not represent or include me. And so these are just a few examples of some of the quotes that students said. And so from this, basically what I identified after looking at those barriers were 4 different things that really were important and key to fostering equitable student success. And so I dubbed those core goals. And those stand for cultural competency, organized community, representation, and extra resources. And so with these, again, seeing that there would be a good impact on retention when you kind of insert some of these things. And so we're going to talk about all of those a little bit more in depth. When we talk about cultural competency, cultural competence is the ability to understand, communicate with, and effectively interact with people across cultures. Cultural competence encompasses being aware of one's own worldview, developing positive attitudes towards cultural differences, gaining knowledge of different cultural practices and worldviews. And so how do we address that barrier? Well, we can do it by a few different means. And so here are just some examples. We could have new employee, faculty and staff, and even student leader diversity and inclusion training. It could be mandatory. It could be something that they can opt into. Things that could be covered in something like this could be implicit bias. It could be inclusive language, microaggressions, and intersectionality. So some topics that are really important when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. We can include voices that have been silenced in class readings and incorporate author analysis. And so this means if you're a faculty member, have you looked at your syllabus? And when you're looking at your syllabus and you're looking at the readings you're assigning and the journals that you're assigning, are you looking at the authors? And are those authors all white? And if they are you talking about an author analysis? Are you talking about how their point of view is coming from a white point of view? And so that might be different from what other people would think about. Are you including other authors on your syllabus that identify with different backgrounds to make sure that you're offering diverse course readings? Diversity and inclusion instruction early on, like an orientation for students, would really help set a campus culture. And so making sure that we're talking about this as soon as possible. And again, this is applicable for any predominantly white institution in higher education in the United States. And then a bias incident reporting system. Do students know where they can report a bias incident? Either if it's themselves that are perpetuated against, or if they see someone else and are a bystander of it happening to someone else. Do they know that they can say, hey, you can go here and report this so that other people are aware? And again, having that process. Organized community. This is kind of a term I made up, but it's not just community, it's community that colleges and universities specifically organize to make sure that we are helping students foster that sense of belonging. And so I kind of define it as purposefully create foundations to aid in community development and foster a sense of belonging on campus for underrepresented students. And so how do we address that barrier? Well, student groups are technically organized community. And so student groups like Black Student Association, Asian Student Associations, Latinx Student Associations, Muslim Student Associations, we have a Delta Alpha Pi here, which recognizes high achieving students with disabilities. And so these are all kind of communities that we organize to help students who are underrepresented find that community and find people who are going through things similar to them. The Multicultural Center, the Equity and Inclusion Office, and the Pride Center are all examples of organized community. Summer bridge programs, which I know we have, are really important for helping students find that community early on, even before they come to campus on that first day of school. And then, of course, student of color mentoring programs. And it could be student to student based. So it could be, students, one of the program that we have built out is for upper class students to basically mentor incoming freshman students. And so it could be student to student, but it could also be a faculty or staff member of color that mentors any undergraduate student of color. Or it could be bringing back alumni of color to campus and having them mentor. And so this is really important for predominantly white institutions where there is that lack of representation on campus. And we know that diversifying our faculty and staff is no easy feat. And so let's draw on populations we might already have that we're not utilizing. And so let's look at our alumni of color and figure out if there is a way to better engage them, bring them back to campus and help them serve our community and other students who can look at someone and say, they're able to do it. And so I'm going to be able to do it too. And that really goes into the next one with this, which is representation. And so representation is something that you're all probably pretty familiar with, and that's having and seeing positive role models from the same racial and or ethnic background. I love this quote that I saw recently, and so I include it here. And it's when you're the only minority in the room, you become keenly aware of the responsibility that comes with it. And this is something that many students face at predominantly white institutions. And so how do we address that barrier of a lack of representation? Well, first thing is we really do need more faculty and staff of color. And so focusing on how we can better diversify the representation of our professional staff to really model what we're hoping the representation of our students will look like. Alumni of color mentoring programs, again, faculty or staff or student to student can all help with increasing representation on campus. Faculty working to incorporate books and articles written by people of color in courses, again, can also help increase representation. Because now as we're thinking about academics and we're thinking about people who have gone off and published things, we're also seeing ourselves in those. We're seeing people of color, we're seeing people who might be multilingual, we're seeing people who might have disabilities. And so again, making sure there's diversity in that. More multilingual faculty and staff is important too. I just recently spoke with a student who says, his English is not great, but he speaks 3 languages. He also speaks Portuguese and Spanish. And so that is 2 more than most of us. And so even though his English may not be great, it's not a marker at all of his intelligence. And he feels like it is. And so having more multilingual faculty and staff to really help students like that and see that they can be successful too. Considering supports for faculty of color and the time that they put forward towards supporting students of color. Oftentimes, when you're at a predominantly white institution, you have much fewer faculty and staff of color. And so they kind of step into these roles where they just become these mentors to students. And so while a student might have a different faculty advisor, they might not be comfortable talking to their white faculty advisor about some things that they would be more comfortable talking to someone who looks like them. And so they kind of just come into these roles of mentorship. But oftentimes what we see is it takes a big toll on their time. And so what supports do we have in place for faculty and staff who may be going through something like this? And then just making sure we have equitable hiring processes. So we're making sure that as we go through hiring, as we look for new hires and bring new people to our community, hoping that there is some representation surrounding them and really bringing in different voices that maybe we haven't heard as much in the past. Extra resources. So extra resources is having the necessary additional resources to support students coming from diverse racial, socioeconomic, and educational backgrounds. And so how do we address a barrier like this? Well, there are so many resources that we have available to students. I'm actually really proud of how many resources we have available to our students here at ETSU. I feel like I learn about a new resource myself almost every day. And recently I actually came up with basically a huge guideline of all the different resources we have available to our students. And it was about 30 different pages. And so you see again, how many different resources we have. Some of those can be peer-to-peer tutoring. It can be explaining the purpose of office hours. So really making sure that students know what office hours are. We see a lot of times with first generation students that they're not sure what office hours are. They actually might think that that is the time that a faculty member sits in their office and gets their work done. They don't know that that's a time that they can visit faculty. And so making sure you're defining what that is, both in your syllabus, but then also in person on that first day of classes is really helpful too. Reach out to students in need of help. If you see a student struggling, flag them. That's submitting an academic care report on them. If it's making sure that you share with their advisor that you're concerned about them, your department chair if you're a faculty member, or making sure that you share it with someone who might be in a role like mine, where they're a director for student success, but really just making sure that we're helping students get the resources that they need. Many times we have the resources, students just aren't aware of them. Multicultural centers, a lot of multicultural centers will have open study hours. And so this is kind of a time where students can come. And again, because it's a multicultural center, a lot of times it's a diverse array of students who come together. And so just a great place for them to find community, but also be working on academics together. Workshops on how to find research, making sure that we're not just assuming that students who come to us know how to find research and know how to do that for their papers. Again, first generation students, low income students, students of color, oftentimes don't always have that experience in their secondary schools where they know how to find academic research and they know how to utilize evidence-based practices. So making sure we can explain and have those resources available to them. Graduation help desks, really focusing on one-stop shopping. So a lot of times making sure we're not just sending students from place to place to place to place, but that there's one place that they can go and they know that they can find an answer so that they don't get discouraged and stop looking for it. Counseling centers, so important. I send a student there probably just about every day. Targeted scholarships and grants to different populations of students. Greater on-campus jobs for students who identify as low income is something that's really important. We want to keep them on our campus. And so this is a great way to do that so that they don't have to go off campus to work. Food pantries. I know Bucky's Food Pantry is great for our students and just a phenomenal resource. And so making sure we have a resource like that, or a resource like a meal swipe program, where basically students who have extra meal swipes can donate them to students who might be food insecure so that they can use those. Career closets, making sure that students can be successful after graduation, especially as they get to that junior and senior year and they might be looking at applying for jobs or internships, making sure that they have the clothing that they might need to be successful in an interview or help them have that step up. And then holiday and summer housing is something that's really important. And so when we close our institution, we need to know that just because we leave it doesn't mean that every student that we have has a safe place to go for that time. And so many times students will leave for one of these holidays and they won't have a safe home environment to go to, or maybe they're struggling with homelessness if they're not living on campus. And so just making sure, again, that they have holiday and summer housing available to these students. Same thing if they have a meal plan, they might rely on that meal plan to get all 3 meals a day. And if they are not here and because our campus is closed, then suddenly the food that they rely on is not available to them. And so these are just some of the resources that can help us with really combating that barrier and offering extra resources to these students. I know I've thrown a lot of information at you. And so let's kind of start with the basics. And so if we just think about what can we do pretty quickly, right? What can we do immediately? Well, have you define what office hours are in your syllabus and in class? And are you sure all of your students know what they are? Again, this is an easy step that people can take to really make sure that students know that this exists and what it's for. Look at authors of the books on your syllabus and the journals you're assigning. Are they all white? Is there more than one author of color? It's great to say, well, I actually have an author of color, but it would be even better to say I have several on my syllabus instead of just one. Are you acknowledging the author's race and how that could impact their perspective in class when you talk about these readings? Do you share, and this is written by a white man in 1963, and so maybe that perspective is not really the perspective of what everyone would have during this time period. Are you using your pronouns in your syllabus, on your email, and even on Zoom? This can help students who identify with different pronouns feel like it's a safe space for them to share what their pronouns might be, whereas otherwise they might feel like that's something they need to hide. When you're requiring internships in your major curriculum, are you helping low-income students find paid internships? Oftentimes what I see with students is that as they kind of move into their junior or senior year and they have this required internship, what it means is they are now taking classes, working their full-time job, and now working an unpaid internship on top of that. And so really making sure that if you have a student who is really struggling with finances, that we're helping them to the best of our ability find an internship that would be applicable for their major, but also that would be paid so that they don't have to also work that job full-time and then have an internship and then be taking classes. We want to make sure that their load is more manageable and more equitable. Do students who aren't doing well in classes have the technology resources they need? This is something that became so much more evident during COVID. And so if we do think about a few of the positives that came out of this pandemic, one of the very few positives is the fact that I think it did highlight inequities in higher education, especially when it came to something like technology. And so not only do students need laptops, what about hotspots? It's one thing to give a student a laptop, but then they don't have Wi-Fi. What about noise canceling headphones for students who live in multi-generational homes, or students who have a lot of siblings, or students who might have children of their own? And so how do we make sure that they're able to focus on their work when they don't have a designated workspace on campus? And so those are all things that became really important during COVID too. These are just some of the things that I've kind of shared with our Plummer community, different things for DEI. So how to make your email more inclusive and engaging. During COVID, really supporting virtual student success. And so knowing that that looks a little bit different than in-person classes. Technology resources to support equitable student success. And so again, making sure that students have all of these different resources that might be important for them. We have a Clemmer College Scholarship, and I believe it's pretty easy. I think that the application is pretty explainable, but not every student might think that, especially students who might be intimidated by filling out something like that because they haven't done it before, or because they're first gen and their parents can't help them with that. And so we have different videos called how-tos to share with students how they can do it. And it literally walks them through the whole process. And so we have a whole how-to on how to apply for Clemmer College scholarships. And so even though it's just a short application, this shows them step-by-step what they need to do. Every Wednesday, we put snacks out for our students. We used to just do this for finals and midterms, but then we found out that students just really appreciate it. And it also helps students who might be struggling with food insecurity or might be working all night and they come straight to campus from their job and they haven't had a chance to grab a meal. And so even though it's just a snack, it could be, a tangerine or it could be Cheez-Its, but it helps tide them over during class. And so just making sure that those things are available to our students as they need them. And then one of the things, we actually have this sticker that we shared with our community, and it is that no matter where you're from, we're glad you're here. It's one of our Clemmer College stickers, and it's translated into 8 different languages on top of that. And so that's something that we've shared with our faculty and staff and our students here as well. And then, of course, we have social media where students can access us a lot more readily. And it's actually something that I do check pretty late at night, but I know that many students are working full-time jobs. And so they're working during the times that our offices are open. And so oftentimes they don't get to really talk to us until after 4:30, which is when most of us have left. And so this is a way where they could almost DM us basically over Instagram, but we're able to get back to them a lot more quickly. And so students might have questions that are time sensitive, or it might be the only time that they're going to ask this question. And if we don't answer it from them now, they're not going to go out and seek that answer again. And so we want to make sure we get back to them as quickly as possible. And so that's kind of one of the ways that we help students who might be working some jobs like that or working abnormal hours. This is something that I hear often when I talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I always kind of try to address it in every presentation that I give. And it's a statement of people saying, well, I don't see color. And so, I don't really think I need to, be in DEI work because I just don't see color. And so what people of color hear when you say something like that is when you don't see color, you don't see me. You don't see the struggles that I've gone through. You don't see my background. You don't see my history. You don't see the history of my ancestors, and you don't see the additional challenges and barriers and obstacles that might be in place for me that you might not have experienced based on your own identity. And so again, just knowing that this comment of the I don't see color is really just a comment that's never appropriate, especially when we're talking about making sure that we're talking about equitable student success and students gain the resources that they need to be successful. So last but not least, just a few quick takeaways from this presentation. Again, I know I threw a lot of information out at you, but basically quick takeaways: when looking at policies, processes, and procedures, always question, how can I make this more equitable? Put your equity lens on. And so that's something that I often have to do. Put this equity lens on and look at almost any situation in higher education and ask yourself, is this equitable? And if not, how can I make it more equitable? As much as possible, extend grace, not judgment. Oftentimes we don't know a student situation. And oftentimes it could be something like working crazy hours, being responsible for multiple people in their family, being the main caregiver in their family. It can be a plethora of different reasons. And so we want to make sure that we're really talking to them to understand, why aren't they coming to class? Or why is their work not up to par with what we're expecting? Or if they were rude to us, why? Cultural competency is ever changing. So be open to learning and growth. I don't think there is ever a time that someone can just say, well, I am culturally competent now. It is ever changing. And so just making sure that you continue to learn and grow with it. The importance of community for students and developing a sense of belonging and engagement. We see sense of belonging so closely correlated with student success and making sure they get across that graduation stage and have the supports they need and people around them. Representation matters. It matters so much. I'll tell you that I was a junior in high school before I had the first Asian teacher that I ever had. And when I had her, I remember looking at her name was Michelle Vidal, and being like, I never expected to have an Asian teacher. And we became very close. I ended up being a babysitter for her kids, but it was just this connection that I didn't have with any other teacher as much as I had with this one, because it was the first time I looked at someone and saw someone like me. Some students may need additional resources. Share them with students in need. So share those resources or send them to someone who knows them. If you don't feel confident that you know all of the resources available to students, there are other people that you can send them to, whether that's your department chair or someone who's in a position, again, similar to mine, but making sure that students are connected with those resources. Because again, oftentimes we have them, we might not be aware that they're in place. And so making sure we connect them. Student success really is an all-in effort, especially equitable student success. One of my quotes that I always share is faster alone, further together. And that's especially important when we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion work. Oftentimes it's a good amount of people who are very impassioned by the work, but there's always people that we're missing. And so making sure we're bringing them along too and sharing this information with them is just so important. And so again, remembering that it really is an all-in effort. And when we're looking at equitable student success, we're not just looking at faculty and staff of color and expecting them to kind of fill that role. We're looking at all of our faculty and staff and helping them make sure that we are promoting student success that is equitable to all of our students. So that is the end of my presentation. I'm also happy to answer any questions and then also talk about some of the things that we have done at Clemmer College. I kind of took that out of the presentation earlier, but things that we've done at Clemmer College to kind of address some of these barriers already. I also have my phone number and my email on here if you do have any questions that you're not comfortable asking in a group setting but want to talk about. Or if you're just ever like, I really want to talk about equitable student success today, I am happy to meet up for a coffee and we can just talk about equitable student success all day long. So please never hesitate to reach out to. And thank you again all for being here today.
Thank you, Jessie. That was amazing. I'm gonna maybe give people one more minute to write down your information. You need it, but then maybe we can close the slide so I can see if people want to ask questions. I feel like that was incredible. And let's see. Okay, so if you have questions or comments for Jessie, feel free to use the chat, but also feel free to just throw your hand up, whether it's virtual or your actual hand on video. And feel free to join in on the conversation here. If you don't, I will. Okay, well, I'm gonna take the lead you dropped at the end there, Jessie. Would you talk a little bit? So I loved at the very end when you started to talk about some of the things that or you showed us examples of things that you've done at Clemmer, like the social media and the magnet stickers in the different languages and things like that. Could you just share a couple of the things that you feel like have made the biggest impact that you've implemented at Clemmer?
Yeah, so I'll share that one of the things that was really interested is back when we were last year, when we were really in deep with the pandemic and we were all virtual, we kicked off a program called Solve, which was supporting online learning and virtual engagement. And it was a student committee. And on that student committee, we had a deaf student. And while so many students were talking about how it was so much harder to learn online, she shared that actually it was so much easier for her and how much more equitable it was to be online rather than in person, because for the first time, she could pause videos if their learning was that way. She could go back and rewatch them to really understand what people were saying. She could add subtitles to things, which is something you can't do in a class, right? And so it was just so much more equitable to her. And that really opened my eyes because in my opinion, so many students had just said, online learning is so hard and it's not a way that I can learn. And I kept seeing all the inequities with it. But then for the first time, I started seeing how it was more equitable for some students too. And so that was something that was just really interesting to me that came out of this committee. Another thing we've done is we do have a student of color mentoring program that we're developing out of Clemmer College. And so it kind of just started and we're basically matching up upperclassmen students with incoming freshman students of color. And so again, this program is just really helping students kind of identify other people who might look like them and have gone through similar struggles. We've met with all of our different mentors and they've shared really why they're interested in a program like this, but also why it's so important to give back and how they wish that they had someone when they were a first-year student who looked like them, who could kind of help guide them throughout that college process. Some of the conversations that we have in there are also related to diversity, equity, inclusion. And so we do talk about things like recognizing and responding to microaggressions. I will give a quick shameless kind of plug that I am giving a lunch and learn later in February, I believe, on recognizing and responding to microaggressions. And so again, the importance of that, especially for students of color. So a lot of times, like I said, when I was younger, I just didn't know how to respond to them. And so having this toolkit to know how to respond, even in non-confrontational ways, but ways that just question and make other people reflect is something that's really important for students to have. And so we talk about things like that within this program as well. On top of that, we are building out our first program. And so we have not kicked that off yet. It is still in the process. But what that will look like is unlike our student of color mentoring program, instead of being paired from student to student, we're actually looking at faculty and staff who identifies first generation and pairing them with a first generation student so that a student can see someone who is successful, who is going through the same thing that they've gone through, who also identifies as first gen, but also because many times first generation students can be really intimidated by faculty and staff, more so than students who might be more social savvy in a sense, because they grew up knowing the importance of networking. Right. And so this population of students didn't really have that. And so pairing them with someone who is in a position like a faculty or staff member, but having a more informal relationship with them is something that we have found really helpful too. So that is going to be kind of the next program that we kick out. And inside of that, we're actually going to have a few different kind of conversations that we want to lead. And so I'll share really quickly just what some of those topics are that we've identified as being important. And so things like money talks, like one of them would be called something like what the FAFSA. And so helping students figure out the FAFSA. It's not always common sense, personal finances. And so knowing that a lot of students who are first generation students don't know, really the personal finance and how to keep count of that as well. Know your worth, salary negotiations. You're awesome, but your resume probably sucks is actually a talk I've given before. It was actually well attended. Again, when you put these spins on things, all of a sudden students become so much more interested in them. So the importance of a title sometimes, but really helping them with their resume, networking, cover letters, job interview tips, applying to grad school, because we might get them through undergrad, but then they're looking at grad school. And if they didn't have anyone to guide them through undergrad, they definitely don't have anyone to guide them through grad school. You are enough, overcoming imposter syndrome, and then ain't nobody got time for that. A time management workshop you probably don't have time for. And so these are just some of the things that we kind of want to talk about with our first generation students that we think might be helpful for them as they navigate college and higher education. So that's kind of some of the things that we have talked about and done. I'll say that one other thing that we're working on actually as a university right now, we're having these discussions, is bringing a chatbot to campus, which is artificial intelligence. But basically what it is that on the main page of our ETSU website, there would be a live chat where they could type up a question at any time and they would get a response. And what that really helps is students who might be working full time. And so by the time they have time to ask a question to someone, it's past the times that we're working. But this is the time that they have the question, they want that response, and this is when they're going to move forward on it. So we do want to make sure we're getting back to them. And so they would be able to ask a question to a Bucky chatbot, and Bucky would be able to answer their question for them. And so that's actually something we're working on, considering bringing to campus right now for ETSU as a whole. And so we've seen a lot of research and data that supports that this really helps with cultivating equitable student success and breaking down summer melt. So I know that was just even more that I threw at you, but now I am completely done, I promise.
No, I love it. I'm also, I love the ideas here, of course, but I'm endlessly impressed by your clever language and all of your acronyms. Like, wow. You're in your shower and you're like, oh, that's a good acronym. Well, yeah, I was writing down core earlier, and then solve, and you have strive, and I was just like, okay, this is that's a really impressive skill too. So does anyone else want to ask Jessie a question? Don't be shy.
Just a message from the chat. Allie from Psychology had to run to a meeting, but she says she would really like to connect more about implementing some of the strategies for equitable student success in the psychology department.
Awesome. I will definitely take her up on it. It sounds like she wants coffee to talk about equitable student success. And so I am always up for that. That's perfect. And thank you all so much again for being here today. And I know it's December 1st and the end of a crazy semester. So I appreciate you all taking the time and sharing your lunch with me too.
Yeah, I also want to say that I love the timing of this, Jessie, because even though it felt like it was, you were sharing a lot of things, like, I feel like that kind of like reminder in some ways, like it was like, yeah, that's a reminder of like, it's important to do those things, but also kind of the inspiration of like how to do better is really like beautiful to hear at this point in the semester where like, we're kind of all hanging on by like tentacles, including like me, my students, everyone, like we're all just like, scrabbling towards the end. And so I really loved like thinking about things, made me excited about like, how can I do better next semester? The fresh start is coming.
It's coming. It's so close. 3 more weeks and then we have like a winter break. We're so close.
Yes. So I love the timing of this because it gave me a lot of things to think about for spring. And so if no one else wants to jump off mute, I am going to say that, again, a huge thank you to Jessie for taking the time, giving us so much at the end of this semester, because I know it's also an incredibly busy time for you. And thank you to all of you for being here, especially if you've been at a lot of our events, which I see a lot of repeat attendees, and I appreciate you all for coming. And of course, WGSS will be back with more WGS on Wednesdays in the spring. So we will share that lineup. Keep an eye out, and we hope you'll come back for more. So again, thank you so much, Jessie. Thank you all for being here. Good luck with this last week and next week and the week after, and then hopefully we'll all get a break. So like 3 more weeks, but really hang in there, everyone. I appreciate you. And yeah, I will see you in the spring.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, Jessie.